The Garden of Flowing Fragrance at the Huntington Library is one of the largest classical Chinese gardens outside of China. Steve Koblik, president of the Huntington Library, will talk about the creation of the garden and stories behind. The name was chosen from Cao Zhi's Luo Shen Fu, right?
Exactly. It was exactly right. It was because we had read classical tradition in the classical poetry. It was very, for those of us who are not Chinese, it was a wonderful experience of learning how to name a garden. So we got interested in the idea of building a Chinese garden. And that conversation began in the 1980s.
In the 80s.
In the 1980s. And we talked about it, and the people who were discussing it were very excited. But the Huntington did not have a lot of money, and there is no public garden, a Chinese garden, in California, even though Chinese have been an important part of California for 160 years, financial support. And that came in 2000 when one of our board members, Peter Paniker, passed away, and unbeknownst to us, he left us $10 million to build a Chinese garden, because he'd been involved in that earlier conversation, and he had been excited about it.
Yeah.
He wasn't Chinese, but he thought it was a wonderful idea.
What have been the challenges on the way to make it happen?
Well, I should say that building the garden has been a labor of love for those of us who've been involved, because there wasn't any model here in the United States for us to follow. We made a decision early that our Chinese garden, which would be authentic, and everything would be built in China, and then brought all the materials, and then brought to California, also had to meet California building codes.
Okay.
And that means particularly seismic codes. So the most difficult challenge in the beginning was trying to figure out how to use classical Chinese design and classical Chinese construction and yet have contemporary seismic buildings that would withstand large earthquakes. The companies that we were using in China were the traditional companies that had building Chinese scholar gardens for hundreds of years. And so in the process of their building these gardens, they modernized some of their images. So the gardens reached their peak in the Ming period, about 400 years ago. But in the intervening time, they had modernized some of the images of the flowers and the birds. So the wood carvings were more modern. And when we came to Zhou, and they had done the carvings, and we were looking at them, we didn't feel that was right. We thought they should be using the kinds of images that you would see in a garden 400 years ago, in the Ming period. In the Ming period. And that led to a very interesting discussion, because it turns out, not surprisingly, this 2 or 3 generations of artisans working at Zhou had never been exposed to the earlier images. They were working off of what had preceded them immediately. And there had been a natural progress of design. And we were saying, no, let's go back 400 years. And so when they finally said, okay, that's a good idea, Steve, but where do we find the images? And when we said, our curator, Jun Li, will come over with Chinese prints and Chinese drawings from the Ming period, and they will show you how they did it. And we did. And they changed all of their wood carvings so that they went back to the Ming period. And again, what that does for the Chinese company, when they have a Chinese patron who wants to build a garden in China, they can now say, you can have the modern images, or you can have the images from the Ming period.
Yeah. As you mentioned, most of the materials of the garden were shipped from China, including 850 tons of sculptural Taihu limestone rocks. Costco chairman Mr. Wei Jiafu is pretty proud that he shipped all of them for free. So can you please share some details of your cooperation with China in the creation, more details?
Sure. First of all, we've had wonderful support from Mr. Wei. Let's start with that. And he was very early in the project. I mean, the project has as you said, is kind of like raising a child, and you needed people who believed in it early when you couldn't see it. And Mr. Wei was one of those people, and so his support of bringing the rocks over was absolutely fundamental to the success of the garden, because the rocks are so essential in a Chinese garden. So we were extraordinarily thankful that he was able to do this. We were also appreciative of the governments in China that were willing to allow us to take the rocks, because that's a separate problem, but one that there's now an export ban on Taihu rocks, because China is growing so fast and they're building so much, there just isn't enough material. And that goes to another part of the question, which is we've gotten tremendous support from both the government in Beijing and the provincial government and the Suzhou government. We've gotten all of the different levels of the Chinese governments have wanted to support this project. And when that happens, then, and they've talked to businessmen in China and encouraged them to support us. So we've gotten, Air China, for example, has basically provided free seats for all of the artisans that came to do the work on the garden, as well as free seats for myself when I went to China or my staff went to China. So it's been a really collaborative effort. And we've tried to really be very careful to do the right thing, so everyone could look at the garden and say, they're building a classical garden, they're not interested in politics. And that, as you know, is very important, because the Chinese community is a huge population in China, but there's also huge numbers of Chinese everywhere in the world. And we wanted this garden to be a classical garden that was available for everybody.
Yeah.